Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm coming to you with yet another book review, and this time we are looking at Gunmetal Gods by Zamil, Akhtar. And this is my very first indie book that I have ever read and reviewed, and wow. Wow. This book is incredible. Okay, it's absolutely incredible. If I had to try to explain what the book is, I would say it is a combination of the dark fantasy elements of Game of Thrones, mixed in with the horrific real-life war of the Crusades of the Middle East, with cosmic horror existing in the background. A combination specifically of H.P. Lovecraft and Junji Ito's flavors of cosmic horror. And that all culminates together in a very unique and refreshing experience for a fantasy book. Okay? I began reading this on the 9th. I finished reading it today on the 16th. Of course, you won't see this video till later. And yeah, I'm just in love with the book. I am absolutely in love with the book. It isn't perfect. There are things about it that I don't like. They're very minor nitpicks. But overall, I was blown away by this. I wasn't expecting very much. You know, I found this book when I was watching Daniel Green's author bookshelf roast video, and the cover art immediately grabbed my attention because, I mean, come on, how could it not? Look at this. The colors are vivid. The eldritch abomination in the background is eye-catching, especially when you get a scale of it compared to the people. The font choice is incredible. There is the spine for anyone wondering, and then the back just gives you a brief write-up. I did go for the hardcovers because I'm a hardcover guy. And I actually bought this book and his other two novels and his novella in the series all at the same time. My thought process was, if I don't like them, I'll donate them to my local library, and I'll still get to support an independent author. But luckily, I loved it, and I can't wait to jump into the rest of the books. Yeah, this was a fascinating read. So one of the coolest things about it to me is that instead of being in some kind of fictional allegory to Europe, like you would in A Song of Ice and Fire or Tolkien's Middle-earth, or really any other mainstream popular fantasy series, we're instead set in a fantastical world inspired by the Middle East primarily, because it's kind of an allegory to the Crusades. You have two sides on taking place in this book as opposite ends of a war. You have the Latians, who represent the Ottoman Empire, I believe, and you have the Crusades, who belong to the faith of Ethosia, or maybe it's Ethos, I forget. And they are an allegory to the Catholic Church and the Knights Templar. And having grown up Catholic myself, I felt a very unique experience when reading this book, because despite not having been in the faith for many years, there's something about me that is innately drawn towards the Templar. Despite knowing how many atrocities they committed and how awful the Crusades really were, as a kid, growing up in the faith, I thought the Templar were, the most badass knights that ever lived. The stories about them, they seem like an unstoppable force and a righteous, holy force. And while obviously I know things to be different as an adult, I still can't help but feel a pull to them. Which is significant for this book, because one could very easily argue that the Crusades are the bad guys of this book. And I'm going to put quotations over that, because this is a grimdark fantasy. There is no good guy or bad guy, really. It's not that black and white. It's not nearly that simple. You've got people on both sides fighting for what they genuinely believe to be true and righteous. And in that way, it mirrors the real reason in real life why war is an atrocious act and a horrible thing to behold, because you're not fighting evil people. You're fighting good people who believe they're fighting for the right cause. In their mind, you're the evil one. And we see that very much reflected in here. Okay, you have the Latians desperate to defend their home from the invading infidels, and you have the Crusades, who are, in their mind, fighting a righteous holy war to reclaim what they consider their holy land by right. And I love it. I love when I don't have a black and white good guy and bad guy. But despite being, initially and innately drawn towards Micah and the Crusades, the more I read the book and the deeper I got, I found myself shifting sides over to the side of Kava and the Latians. And it's such a weird thing for me because, I don't know, I guess part of me almost feels like I'm being a traitor towards the side that I would have been on at that time period, were I alive at the time of the Crusades. I would have inherently, just by nature, having been Catholic, been on the side of the Knights Templar, or in this case, the Crucians. But I found it very interesting how much I began to sympathize with the other side and even agree with the other side personally. Now, that is personal. You may not. I think it's entirely possible for you to read this book and believe either side to be true, depending on your perspective. There'd be a lot of debate about that, a lot of arguments about the ethics of that. I'm sure we're not going to get into that because that's not what this is about. The point of mentioning it all is to show how good of a job Zamil did in creating a real-life allegory to war. The setting itself, love to see it. Again, having the Zabadar and the Janissari fighting for the Latians against the invading paladins from the Crucians. It's just so much fun. It's so unique. You don't usually see anything besides one faction of knights versus another faction of knights, or maybe a faction of barbarians or whatever in fantasy. So the setting as a whole was a refreshing change of pace. And when I say the setting as a whole, I don't just mean, yeah, they're in a damn desert or whatever. I mean, you're not seeing a lot of the typical environmental descriptions you would be used to. When people talk about eating food, they're not talking about biting into apples and, eating bits of salted pork. They're eating figs and, they're eating lamb or goat. When they're talking about alcohol, it's not ale and wine. It's fermented mare's milk and fermented barley water. Very, very different stuff. And it seems so minor, but it really does a great job in giving a new experience, a fresh experience, a nice palate cleanser from the fantasy that we're all used to. And I still love all of that European-inspired fantasy, but it's just so nice to be pulled to something different and get to experience something different, because I feel like it's not that prevalent in modern fantasy stories, or fantasy stories as a whole. Maybe Asian culture, Chinese, Japanese, so on and so forth, but certainly not Arabic. And so that was really, really interesting to me. Were there flaws with the book? Sure. I'll admit that the pacing wasn't always the best. There were times I felt like he was just kind of foot to the gas pedal, trying to rush to the end. And so there were things like, how quickly some characters fell in love that I was like, not super realistic. Is it a deal breaker for me? No, because I admittedly don't care very much about the romance in the majority of fantasy books. There are exceptions, but for the most part, I'm not interested in romance. And so I didn't really care. Beyond that, the romances that exist are largely tragic romances, and so, I don't know, there's almost an argument to be made that I would rather not get attached to certain characters, and therefore making the relationship feel less than believable might save the reader from a bit of anger. Now, that said, it's grimdark. And I likened it to Game of Thrones for a reason, because Zamil is not afraid to kill named characters, and many, many, many of the named characters in this book die. And some of them die very unceremonious deaths. And I know a lot of folks may hate that. I love it. I love it because it's so unbelievable in so many books when every character that we've gotten to know has this grand epic send-off, because that's not the reality of war. The reality of war is heroic and great men die very unheroic, very unflattering deaths. And many innocents will suffer extremely gruesome deaths. And there's a lot of that. And one scene in particular, which is just really, really violent and really tragic. And I love to see that, because again, it's grounded almost more in reality, which is weird to say for a book that has Jinn and angels and these, eldritch concepts. To say that it's rooted in reality it's weird, because it is and it isn't, again, much in the same way as the Game of Thrones, specifically the TV show, not so much the books, admittedly, because I haven't read the books in a very long time, I don't remember them very well, but in the show of Game of Thrones, you obviously have this very realistic setting, but then you have dragons and White Walkers and, you know, these red witches that can bring people back from the dead, and faceless men who can wear someone else's face and take on their height, voice, memories, everything. And appearance as well. In this, it's very much the same thing. A lot of it is rooted in a very realistic setting, but we have these fantastical elements of the Magi and the Jinn, and this, you know, eldritch cosmic horror lurking in the background, pulling the strings like a puppet master. And it all comes together beautifully. It really, really does. One other flaw I will point out, and it's a very minor nitpick, but I do want to mention it, is in the early chapters, our character, one of our primary characters, I'll say, Kava, has a thing for cherry-flavored hashish. Okay, nothing wrong with that. What I did get annoyed by is reading the words cherry-flavored hashish multiple times within a single sentence or paragraph because it felt very clunky. I felt like he could have just said cherry-flavored hashish at the beginning and then referred to it simply as hashish or cherry flavor at every point moving on past that, because we've already established what it is and don't need it constantly brought up over and over and over again. It'd be like if you were reading A Song of Ice and Fire and every time Jon Snow drew Longclaw, we had to get the full description of what Longclaw is. So instead of just, you know, Jon drew Longclaw and held his stance, it was Jon drew Longclaw, his Valyrian steel sword with a wolf's head pommel. And every time Longclaw's brought up, we get that Valyrian steel sword with a wolf's head pommel over and over and over again. It's tiresome to read and it's clunky. Kind of the same issue I had here. Now that said, I think he realized this somewhere in the about 1/3 of the way through the book. 1/3 to 1/2, because we do meet another character whose preference is apple flavor. And instead of referring to it as apple-flavored hashish every 5 seconds, he would just refer to it simply as apple flavor. And that's much smoother, much more elegant. I almost wish he would go back and edit the first part of this to kind of do the same thing to the cherry-flavored section. I don't know why it irked me so bad, but it did. It felt clunky. Is it a major issue? No. Is it going to affect the overall score of the book? No. But I wanted to mention it because it's something that just irritated me when I was reading it at first, because I was getting so immersed into the story, and then that repetition drew me out of the story for a little bit. So, yeah, minor nitpick, I know, but that's the job of a review, is to find things to criticize. If they exist, point them out. When all that's said and done, though, this book was such a fun read. I mean, I had a lot of questions at every stage going through the book, and many of them were answered very well by the end of the book. Some of them were left mysterious, I know, for future books, which there will be a total of 5 novels overall, and at least 2 novellas, although I hope he writes 5 novellas and releases all 5 in a hardcover compilation. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But, all of that said, no, it was so much fun. There were so many things I didn't see coming. Some things I could predict, and then, you know, character who's important to the guy of the A plot ends up being somehow linked to a character from the B plot, if you want to call it that way. Really, it's not an A plot and a B plot. It's this character's perspective and this character's perspective, and it jumps back and forth between the two every other chapter, alternating. That's how this book works. We read from Kava, then we read from Micah, and then it goes back and forth and back and forth. But there are some characters who are involved in, you know, one of their stories who end up being linked to the other intrinsically, either by their faith or by something in the past, and it was all just tied together beautifully. And that's another way that this reminds me a bit of a Game of Thrones / A Song of Ice and Fire, is it's kind of using the same writing style to a degree, although not having us look at like 7 different character POVs throughout the book. It really sticks to 2 for the majority of the book. And I thought that was a great way to do things. So, I mean, overall, I've been gushing about it. I don't have much to say. I've already given it the criticism that I felt it deserves. If I'm going to give it any more criticism, it won't be toward the story. It'll be specifically an aspect of the physical hardcover. Okay, and while it is a beautiful book, it's it doesn't have a dust jacket. This is a more simple hardcover. There's no dust jacket for something like this. Many authors like this. I'm going to say if you're going to do a hardcover like this, maybe don't do the matte, kind of rubbery, almost feeling cover, because it attracts fingerprints and grime and dirt, and it can be a pain in the neck to clean. I would like to see this redone as a glossy cover. I believe it would look better. Or on your website, give us a downloadable PDF for a dust jacket that we can print off ourselves and wrap around the books, because I think that would do a lot to keep the cover from getting grimy. And if you ever had a bookshelf that's packed tight, like I do, these matte finished books can be difficult to pull in and to pull out of the shelf and put back in the shelf, because they grind against each other and they catch, and it becomes kind of a pain to get them on and off the shelf. So if you don't want to redo them as glossy hardcovers, simply give us a PDF of a printable dust jacket that we can put over the book. I think that would be a really cool thing. You could make it free, or you could charge us like $1.99 to download it. Either way, I would be cool with it, because it would answer my only issue with the physical print of the book. Again, very minor. What do I give the book overall? 5 out of 5 stars. Absolutely 5 out of 5 stars. The majority of the book, while I was reading it, I was thinking this is a 4.5 star read. 4-star read at some points, 4.5 star read, but by the time we got to the end, it solidified itself as a 5-star read for me. And that is something that I find very impressive, because more often than not when I'm reading a book, I'll be loving it in the early and middle sections for it to have it drop the ball at the very end, which is what happened with the final book of the Icewind Dale trilogy by R.E. Salvatore for me. I'll review those books at a later date. The ending tied it together and made it better, in my opinion, and left me both satisfied with the story, but also craving more. And that is what I feel the job of any competent author is to do. So, I mean, yeah, I loved this. I absolutely loved this. I would strongly recommend it to fans of Eldritch Horror, to fans of historical fiction, to fans of epic fantasy and grimdark. I mean, if you love A Song of Ice and Fire / A Game of Thrones, and you love Eldritch Horror, whether it's H.P. Lovecraft or Junji Ito or Stephen King's Eldritch Horror, whichever one. If you like those two things, read Gunmetal Gods. It combines them absolutely beautifully. If you're tired of reading about goblins and elves and dwarves despite loving them, or maybe you hate them, I don't know, but if you're tired of reading about them and you want fantasy that doesn't bring them up, read Gunmetal Gods. Because it very much doesn't. It has its own thing going on, and I can't imagine that's going to change in future books. So, I will absolutely read Conqueror's Blood and Elder Epoch and Death Rider, and I will await the next book to come out, and the next book after that, and the next novella, and hopefully many more novellas to come, because I am loving this series already. I can only hope that the future books are as good or somehow better. But yeah, I love my time with this, and I highly recommend it. So, this has been my review of Gunmetal Gods by Zamil Akhtar. You can check the description down below to find my Goodreads review of the book as well, if you prefer to read that, although you've made it all the way to the end, so I don't imagine that you're going to do so now. But if you want to go check that out, feel free. Feel free to add me on Goodreads, whatever the case may be. And for God's sake, go and buy this incredible book. You can get it on Amazon as a hardcover, a paperback, or an ebook. And right now, Zamil still has the deluxe editions of this book, which are these beautiful, kind of, I believe, leather-bound editions for like $65 that are just stunning. And I would love to get my hands on one, but I just can't justify spending any more money on the book again, because I already own the book once, and I don't tend to buy books twice. So, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And until next time, I will see you later. Peace, and take care.